Okay, let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental question. Since you, me, and everyone else we know already lives in a society, what actually separates a trained sociologist from just a casual bystander? I mean, we all have personal, everyday experience with making friends, understanding religion, or, haggling for a good price at a crowded market. We all know a lot about the social groups we belong to, so why on earth do we need a dedicated science for it?
Well, welcome to this explainer, where we are going to unpack exactly that. Today, we're focusing on explaining the chapter of social science that deals entirely with methodology. We're going to unlock the exact, rigorous procedures that turn your everyday, casual observations into verifiable scientific knowledge. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The science of society, 2. The objectivity challenge, 3. The sociologist toolkit, 4. Into the field, and 5. Village studies in India.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the science of society, why method matters.
The absolute crucial point to understand here is that sociologists aren't different because of what they know. They're different because of how they acquire that knowledge. And that brings us directly to methodology. Now, this isn't just a fancy academic synonym for method. It's the actual rigorous study of the procedures used to gather facts. You see, sociology is deeply interested in the lived experience. When studying something like a local market, a sociologist doesn't just want to take it at face value. They want to understand the deeply held opinions, the unwritten rules, the feelings of the people involved. They essentially want to adopt both the outsider's objective view and the insider's subjective reality. And to do that accurately without just making things up or guessing, your methodology has to be rock solid. Without a reliable method, you honestly don't have science. You just have an opinion.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, the objectivity challenge, the human bias.
Think for a second about the natural sciences. When a geologist studies a rock or a botanist studies a plant, they're completely outside the world they're studying, right? A geologist can look at a rock without their personal feelings getting in the way, and that rock certainly doesn't have an opinion on being studied. But a sociologist, that's a totally different ballgame. A sociologist is a human studying humans. If you're studying family relations, you're not an alien from outer space. You are also a member of a family. You carry your own likes, dislikes, values, and prejudices, all shaped by your specific social environment. This makes true traditional neutrality incredibly difficult. The researcher is tangled up in the exact same social web as their subjects. Tackling this bias is a massive part of doing social science right. So how do they fix it? To combat this inherent human bias, sociologists practice a really cool technique called self-reflexivity. It basically means deliberately and continuously putting your own thoughts and feelings under a microscope while you work. A researcher has to actively try to look at their own work through the eyes of others. Practically speaking, this means researchers will actually explicitly state their own social background right there in their reports. By telling the reader up front, hey, this is who I am, this is where I come from, and these are the experiences that shaped me, they allow the reader to mentally compensate for any unconscious blind spots the researcher might have missed. Objectivity here isn't some magical state of perfect neutrality. It's more of an ongoing, continuous daily practice of self-correction. All right, Section 3, the sociologist toolkit, categorizing research. Because the social world is so complex and has multiple truths, there's literally no single magical road to sociological truth. Instead, researchers use a toolkit of different methods for different questions. For instance, we have quantitative methods for measurable things. Think income averages or demographics. Then we have qualitative methods for abstract things, like shifting political attitudes or emotions. I mean, a survey is great for numbers, but it's terrible for capturing human nuance, right? We also use primary data, which is fresh data you go out and collect yourself, versus secondary data, which relies on existing historical archives to save time. Finally, we have micromethods for small, intimate settings versus macromethods like huge national censuses. The tool you pick depends entirely on what specific layer of society you are trying to uncover. But here's the thing, because every single method we just covered has its own unique strengths and pretty glaring weaknesses, modern social science heavily relies on a concept called triangulation. Just like a GPS uses multiple satellites to find your exact location, sociologists combine these different methods to complement each other. Why does this matter? Well, because combining a massive, zoomed-out macro survey with intimate, micro-level observation ensures that raw numbers are given real human context. Looking at the exact same problem from wildly different vantage points produces a much more robust, accurate picture of reality than any single method ever could on its own. Let's dive deeper into those intimate methods with Section 4. Into the field, the art of participant observation. The history behind how we developed these micro-methods is actually incredible. Back in the 19th century, early anthropologists were what we affectionately call armchair scholars. They quite literally just sat in dusty university libraries, reading secondhand letters from travelers and missionaries. But everything changed in 1914. Bronislaw Milanowski, a Polish anthropologist, was visiting Australia right when World War I broke out. Because Poland was annexed by Germany, he was technically labeled an enemy alien. To serve out his internment, he convinced authorities to let him live in the Trobriand Islands in the South Pacific. For over a year, he lived in a tent, learned the native language, and interacted directly with the people without any interpreters. He completely proved that to truly understand a culture, you have to immerse yourself in it. Thanks to his accidental exile, fieldwork became a mandatory, institutionalized science by the 1920s. How wild is that? Now imagine parachuting into a community where you know absolutely nothing. To survive and understand their whole way of life, almost like a child learning about the world from scratch, researchers follow some very structured steps. First, they conduct a census and literally map the physical layout of the settlement to just ground themselves in the space. Then, and this is crucial, they construct a genealogy. Mapping out family trees is vital because understanding who is related to who often dictates the entire social order, alliances, and economy of that community. Finally, they must learn the language, heavily relying on key teachers from the community known as principal informants, all while obsessively taking daily field notes to record every tiny interaction. But there's a catch when you bring this to modern societies. While early anthropologists studied remote tribes, sociologists adapted these exact methods for modern urban communities. William Foote White spent 3.5 years hanging out with a street gang in an Italian-American slum for his famous book, Street Corner Society. And he quickly realized something. Unlike a remote island tribe, he was studying highly literate people. They could, and absolutely would, read his final book. Even if he changed their names, the community would know exactly who was who. This highlights a massive reality of modern methodology. It places a huge ethical burden on the sociologist. Imagine the people you write your private field notes about actually reading those notes. You have to ensure your deeply personal fieldwork doesn't end up harming the very people who generously let you into their lives.
Finally, Section 5, Village Studies in India, a Post-Independence Shift.
To see how all these concepts and methods apply in the real world, let's look at the 1950s and 60s when Indian sociologists heavily pivoted to village studies. Why the village specifically? Well, first, it provided a bounded community, which was perfectly sized for a single researcher to study in depth, sort of replacing the focus on tribes. Second, Indian scholars deliberately wanted to escape the colonial bias of early anthropology, which used to obsessively focus on so-called primitive aspects of colonized societies. Third, and most importantly, it aligned perfectly with the newly independent Indian government's massive focus on rural development. Since the vast majority of Indians lived in villages, understanding them through rigorous science wasn't just an academic exercise, it was absolutely vital for national progress and policymaking.
This era produced legendary work in wildly different styles. Take the classical approach by M.N. Srinivas. He spent a year conducting intensive field work in a village he called Rampura, but tragically his detailed field notes were destroyed in an arson fire at his university. So what did he do? He accomplished the almost superhuman feat of writing his famous book, The Remembered Village, entirely from memory. That is dedication. Contrast that with S.C. Dubé, who led a massive, multidisciplinary team in a village called Shamirpet. This wasn't just quiet observation, it was a scientific laboratory for designing actual rural development programs, combining sociology directly with economics, agriculture, and medicine to actually improve lives.
So as we wrap up this explainer on the chapter of doing sociology, we've seen how the discipline demands rigorous methodology, how it constantly wrestles with human bias, and how deep immersion can uncover the hidden layers of society. I want to leave you with a final thought to test your own self-reflexivity. If you were tasked with documenting your own neighborhood or community today, how would your unique social background, your age, your family structure, your specific likes and dislikes bias your observations?
think deeply about how your own lived experiences shape the way you view the world around you. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the familiar.